When you think about sushi, salmon might easily come to mind. Apart from tuna, crab, eel and shrimp, it is among the most popular varieties of sushi. Sources vary wildly, but put sushi with salmon somewhere around the third most favorite for Americans and even the second most favorite for Japanese. The thing, however, is salmon sushi isn't a traditional Japanese dish at all. Until the 1980s, eating raw salmon was actually regarded by the Japanese as dangerous and disgusting. So what about the now popular salmon sushi? That was in fact invented by the Norwegian ambassador to Japan in the 1970s in its Tokyo embassy, as part of a marketing campaign from the Scandinavian country to sell their surplus salmon to the largest fish consuming country in the world to start eating salmon. This time in history, the time the Norwegian ambassador invented salmon sushi and got Japan and the world hooked on it. Let's travel to 1970s Japan. Japan had crawled up from the Second World War in an astonishing way. In the decades during and after rebuilding their country, they soon realized the world was interested in their relative cheap but good quality electronics. And so the country started booming economically. Traditionally, the Japanese have always had fish at the center of their diet. Some fish, like tuna, were also eaten raw. Not salmon, however. The reason being that Pacific salmon, the salmon Japanese had access to, was too full of parasites to eat raw. It had to be cooked to be safe for consumption. To Japanese, up until the 1980s, eating raw salmon was like eating raw chicken is to you, an absolute no-go for very logical reasons. They did eat salmon cooked though. As Japan was growing, they started actually eating too much fish. Whilst Japan had always been a fairly self-sufficient country, a lack of fishing regulations quickly started draining their fish supply, up to a point where over 50% of the country's fish had to come from abroad in the 90s. And that's where Norway comes in. You see, on the other side of the world, the Scandinavian country of Norway was also doing very well in the 1970s. Traditionally, Norway was one of the poorer countries in Europe, until, you guessed it, oil was discovered on its territory. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, Norway's economy was doing very well. On top of that, in 1969, Norway successfully implemented a new first-of-its-kind technology, large-scale fish farming. The Norwegians succeeded in breeding large quantities of salmon in cages at sea. So instead having to go out and fish for the salmon, with the chance of disturbing the natural supply, like the Japanese were doing, they could now breed them in a scalable way. In the meanwhile, however, because of the economic boom, the people of Norway started drifting away from their traditional habit of eating a lot of fish, mostly salmon, and started enjoying more meats and important goods instead. So on one hand we have Japan emptying its seas to satisfy its appetite for fish, and on the other hand Norway, who over the course of a couple of years increased their production of salmon multiple times, but did not have the market to sell it to. You are probably already thinking what the Norwegian Ministry of Fisheries, Thor Listau, thought as well. When he visited Japan in 1974, he saw how the Japanese loved their raw fish, but used their salmon in other types of fried dishes. So he came up with the idea, what if the Japanese would eat their salmon raw as well? This wasn't as easily said as done. Firstly, Japan had some very strict trading rules, so it took until 1980 before the first Norwegian salmon hit the Japanese market. At that time, the Japanese still would only use it for grilling and cooking, because remember, the salmon the Japanese were used to was not safe to eat raw. So now the salmon had actually reached Japan. The real challenge awaited the Norwegian, convincing the people their salmon was safe to eat raw. A big challenge. Imagine you'd have to convince an entire country your chicken can be eaten raw and it's actually delicious. It obviously took quite a bit of time and effort, starting in 1986 when a Norwegian Action Committee formed, fittingly called Project Japan, with at its head a man by the name of Bjørn Eirik Olsen. As part of Project Japan, a delegation from Norway met with Japanese interests at the Norwegian embassy in Tokyo, Olsen explains in an online interview. According to him, the then Norwegian ambassador to Japan came up with the idea of using Norwegian salmon in Japanese sushi and served this new combination to his guests, who were very pleased. This man was named Hakon Vexelsen Freihaug, and funnily enough, this major invention is not even mentioned on his Wikipedia page. The only source I could find was Olsen's written memories. Although it's only one source, he was head of the entire Project Japan. It took the group about 10 years to convince the people of Japan they could eat Norwegian salmon raw. At first, they advertised Norway's high quality and crystal clear waters, but that did not really work. The second concern of the Japanese, besides the parasites, was that to them salmon did not have the correct taste nor color. Their local salmon was a bit more red of color instead of the brighter orange one from Norway. And compared to raw tuna, salmon tastes quite differently. So Project Japan took on different approaches. They started collaborating with supermarkets, celebrities and local ad campaigns, and even the Crown Prince and Princess of Norway visited Japan partially to promote their fish. This way they slowly built on the idea of Norwegian salmon sushi. Their big breakthrough came when they hired one of the country's biggest TV chefs, Utaka Ishinabe, also known as the Iron Chef, to promote the idea of salmon sushi. Suddenly, salmon sushi became a new modern thing, instead of a strange, potentially dangerous foreign concept. When one of the largest distributors of frozen fish in the country placed a large order with the Norwegians, the tide had really turned. And by 1995, salmon sushi was a staple item in Japanese restaurants. Currently, its popularity is ever increasing, with some surveys putting salmon as Japan's second favorite sushi. And Norway, they still happily provide their Japanese customers with that salmon. Last year, the country exported over 15 billion euros worth of fish in total, 71% of that being purely salmon. Hope this video didn't leave you too hungry for sushi. If you're hungry for another video, feel free to subscribe and check out our channel for more. And I'll see you next time in history.